Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast, you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. And today we are reading issue number 118. But before we get into that, just a little catch up on what happened in the last couple issues. In the last two issues, we covered a storyline called Widdershins, where we met a new acquaintance named Slobodan, who was from Serbia, who was moving to the UK because he's trying to get away from the war that was going on in Serbia. And it turns out that the house he's moving into is right next to a graveyard, and in that graveyard, the ghosts begin to get disturbed. At first, we think it's because of some construction, but either way, the ghosts are disturbed, and they begin to harass and possess people and make things bad overall. And they possess Slobodan because he has a lot of grief and war trauma that he's trying to forget about in his past. Now, in the last issue, I thought that they were suggesting that Slobodan had actually done some of these like war crimey things, maybe killed a kid or something. But I think that was actually Slobodan just seeing the kid getting killed and not him actually shooting the kid. But either way, he's got trauma from it, and these ghosts are drawn to the trauma. And so they possess him and try to make him kill his child. But luckily, John eventually figured out what was going on, as he made a deal with the ghost before Slobodan did anything to his child. Then when John went to check out the cemetery the next day, he remembered an old saying that was talking about not walking the wrong way through a cemetery. And then as him and Chaz pulled into the cemetery, Chaz went in the way he's used to going, but now there were signs that were saying that was the wrong way. And John figured out from this that it wasn't the construction itself that caused the ghosts to rise. It was that they had put directional signs that were now telling people to go the wrong way through the cemetery, so everybody that was going the wrong way was disturbing the ghosts, basically. And once John figured that out and removed the signs, everything was fixed. And that was where we left off with issue 117. So first thing for issue 118, we got the cover. We see Michelle is in the hospital, and she looks like she's about to give birth. She's smiling and maybe in pain a little bit too. And we see John and Rich staring at her. And then in the background, we see in the monitor of her life support systems is the face of an old woman watching her as well. And we see the writer of this issue is Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we start off in Rich's house, and we're specifically looking through the living room entry door into the hallway that has the stairwell and the entrance door. And through the living room door, we see John and Rich moving back and forth. John has a suitcase, then Rich has clothes, and they're both looking very disheveled. And each time we see both of them, they're both saying stuff. So as John carries a duffel bag past, we hear him say, "Shit." Then we see Rich run by with clothes, and he says, "Shit." Then we see Rich run back across the doorway, and this time he looks at us, and he says, "Look, don't move. Just don't bloody move, all right? Shit." Then he comes back across again with empty hands. Then we see him again with full hands, and now he's dropping clothes everywhere, and he's saying, "Oh man, forget the duffel bag. Stay there a minute. Wait, hang on." And then Rich bends down to pick up the clothes. Then we see John trying to run across the doorway as well, and he's got a suitcase in his hand, so he doesn't see Rich on the floor, and he's yelling, "Oi, will you get a move on?" But then he trips over Rich, and he falls down next to him on the ground, and as he lands, they both say shit. Then we cut to inside the living room, where we see Michelle and Danny are watching the two through the doorway, and as John gets to his hands and knees to try to get up, and Danny says to Michelle, "Industrial little miscreants, aren't they? Shall we give them a hand?" And Michelle replies, "Nah. I want to see what happens when it gets difficult." And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Life and Death and Taxis. And speaking of taxis, as we turn to the next page, we see Johnny, Rich, Danny, and Michelle crammed into Chaz's taxi, and he's now driving them to the hospital. And as he drives, Chaz smiles and looks at John and says, you should see your mug, Constantine. Fucking priceless. And John snaps back, yeah, well, not my style, is it? I can't handle all this baby bollocks. Then we cut to a panel of Chaz driving crazily as he's trying to get to the hospital quickly, and he almost hits a person who was walking across a crosswalk. And Chaz continues talking to John like he didn't even notice the guy trying to cross, and he says, thought I'd never see the day when you was the clueless one, John. You needn't have worried, you poor sod. She's ages yet. For one thing, her contractions are too far apart, aren't they? And then John turns to him sarcastically and says, that's your professional opinion then? And Chaz earnestly replies, course it is. I'm a taxi driver, aren't I? I've done this more times than Dr. Bloody Kildare. And as he says this last line, we see the taxi pull up to the hospital. Then we turn the page and we cut to John coming home alone. And as he walks up the stairs, his narration says, bloody horrible. 6 hours of standing like a lemon, and Shell didn't even drop the sprog. She won't for ages, apparently. So I've left Danny on guard duty and scarpered, proving once and for all that I'm useless when it comes to kids. I can only take solace in the fact that I don't care, which I intend to prove shortly if I ever get anywhere near the pub. And just as John thinks this, we see John's friend Straff come out of the lower flats in this house, and he says, John? And John stops on the stairs and says, oh no. And then he turns to Straff and he continues saying, not a bloody chance, Straff. I'm going upstairs to urinate copiously, and then I'm going to fill the void with Guinness. And you, my son, are going to take care of whatever it is by your lonesome, all right? Then Straff nervously says, all right, mate. You go on and have a good time, eh? I'll stay here. It's just me mum, see? And I guess John can see the anguish on Straff's face, so John turns to come back down the stairs and he says, what is it this time? Then we cut to Straff's mom's bedroom, and we see her laying in bed, and Straff is telling John, I told you she was getting worse, John. She's been here since this afternoon. Hasn't moved a muscle, and I can't bloody go out till she wakes up. Then we get a panel that's a flashback to how Straff found his mom, and she is face down in the cat litter box, and she has a death grip on the pooper scooper. And over this panel, Straff narrates, I got in from the post office earlier, and there she is, face down in the middle of a bleeding cat tray. And there's Bandit looking at her like he's just filled his life's ambition. And I should mention that Bandit is the name of their cat, and the narration continues. Every time's more bizarre than the last time. I'm beginning to think she does it on purpose. Then we cut back to current time in the bedroom, and Straff pulls back the covers to reveal that his mom still has a death grip on the pooper scooper. And Straff continues saying, I mean, look, I haven't been able to get this out of her hand since 3 o'clock. And John sees the pooper scooper and says, whosoever removeth this shit scooper shall rightly be crowned King of England. But Straff is not in a joking mood, and he turns to Constantine and yells, laugh if you want. I don't care. I swear, John, I fucking hate her. Then we see John light a cigarette, and as he puffs on it, his narration says, poor bastard. He probably wouldn't take the only advice I'd give him, like putting a pillow over the old cow's face and ending his misery once and for all. Inside Betty's room, time has now slowed to a crawl, so as not to disturb the comatose serenity. Undaunted, the clock continues its inexorable march through time. The stench of wasted days and mental decay is everywhere, but it's stifled by the cloying scent of omnipresent old lady perfume. Thing is, you just know Betty's going to go out as badly as she can, and if at all possible, she'll drag everyone with her. So under this narration, we get a close-up of a clock that is in Betty's room, and it looks like it's standing still. And then we also get a panel of Betty's face as John talks about how she's going to make it as hard as possible for everyone. And she kind of looks like maybe she has a smile, but that might just be the art implying that. So it looks like John has had enough of being in this room, so he puts his jacket on and he says, that's it for me, mate. I'm off. And Straff asks, what? Where are you going? And John replies, anywhere but here. Then we turn the page, and we get 4 panels that are showing different moments in the same time. And in the first one, we see the red line of a heartbeat monitor, and we're seeing it beat once, and the narration says, 1 a.m. You can tell it's 1 a.m. because that's when the orderlies get most of their work done. You can hear that it's 1 a.m. And the next panel is the clock on Betty's wall, and the narration continues. You can feel the clock ticking your life away as you finally come to an awareness in your bed. It's dark, but you still know what time it is, It's too late. Then we get a panel of the orderlies in the hospital walking back and forth, and we see Rich is passed out in a chair as they walk by, and the narration continues. It won't be long now. Then on the last panel of this page, we see Betty sit up from her bed, and she looks over at the clock, and the narration says, almost time. Then we turn the page, and we cut to the room of John and Danny, and we get some panels that kind of look like shadowy landscapes on the moon, but they're actually of Danny's naked body. So in the first panel, we see Danny's midsection. Of course, shadows are covering specific areas, so it's not too graphic. Then we get a panel of a bedpost. Then we get a panel of one of her breasts. And once again, these are all supposed to look like moon landscapes because John is saying, as he's looking at these things, Mission Control, this is Houston. Come in, Mission Control. Houston, this is Mission Control. Have landed on strange alien planet. Request instructions over. Roger, Houston. Moving in for a closer look. Wait, something's down there. Oh my God. Then we get a panel of John under the covers with his feet sticking out. And obviously he's going down on Danny as he's joking around. And Danny's saying, any sign of intelligent life? And John answers, but the words are unintelligible. And we can kind of assume that he's going down on her. Then we cut to the hospital. And we're seeing the doctors and nurses move around a bit. We see Rich get up from his chair in Michelle's room. And he stretches and says, is it always this fucking boring? And Michelle, who's awake, is just reading a magazine as the nurse checks how dilated she is. Then we turn the page and we cut back to Straff's flat, and Straff is pouring some tea, and the narration says, 3 p.m. You can tell it's 3 p.m. by the nervous anticipation that hangs in the air as the kids get turfed out of school. In the alley outside, some poor lad's about to be scarred for life by the urgent humor of giggling teenage girls. 3 p.m. It's almost time. The withered smell of old lady perfume mingles in with the clean scrub of an untouched heart, beating. It's young and vital and about to live. It's not fair. Then we get a panel of some abstract art. It's a black panel that has a large full heart in it, and floating next to it is a tiny unfilled heart. And I believe these are supposed to represent Betty's heart and the baby's heart. Then we get the next panel, which has the clock in Betty's room in it, and the narration continues saying, beat. It's almost time. Beat. I hear you. And then we see Betty awake now, and she is reaching out towards the clock, and the narration exclaims, wait for me. Then we cut back to John and Danny's bedroom, and I guess they're once again having sex, because last time it was 1 a.m. when John was going down on her, and now it's 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So we see John on top of Danny, and they're covered by their comforter, and she has an arm around his neck, holding him close, and he looks like he's coming, and he's saying, splash down. But just as he says that, Straff bursts through the door and says, John, John! And Danny screams out, and as they sit up and cover themselves, Danny yells, Straff, will you get lost? And John yells, I don't fucking believe this. But Straff doesn't pay attention to what they're saying. He just continues yelling, it's me, Mom. Something's wrong. I think she's dead, John. And then he turns around and takes off down the stairs, and a naked John stands up and says, she'd better be. And then he grabs some clothes and puts them on as he goes down the stairs, and then Straff yells out from inside his flat, in here, hurry. Then we cut to John at Betty's bedside, and he says, shit, all right, look, take it easy, mate. Looks like she's had another heart attack, a bad one. We've got to get her down to the hospital as quick as we can. And Straff, who's freaking out, is saying, oh fuck, I'll call an ambulance and all that then. And John doesn't really move. He just stares down at Betty and says, nah, you just get her out of bed, mate. I've got a better way. Then we turn the page and we cut to Chaz once again helping John to the hospital, but this time we see Betty in the back seat with Straff, and Chaz is looking kind of angry this time. And John's narration says, good old Chaz is round like a whippet with dynamite up its arse. And in 1/10 of the time it'd take the professionals. We're halfway to St. Peter's. And as Chaz drives wildly, John says, cheers, Chaz. Mind the car. I owe you one. Mind the dog. Then we cut to the back seat where we see Straff is talking to his mom saying, oh, Mom, you hang on, all right? We're almost there. Then we get a panel of the same guy trying to cross the street, and John's narration says, of course, this will only end happily if we manage to make it in one piece. Last time I was this scared, I was in a New York yellow cab with a bloke called Abdul. And as Chaz almost hits that same guy crossing the street again, John yells to Chaz, "Red light! Mind the pedestrian!" And because Chaz is driving so wildly, the limp body of Betty begins flying forward, and Straff has to stop her, and he yells, "Ah, she's fallen! What the fuck are you playing at, Chandler?" But right as Straff yells this, we see the reason why Betty flew forward was because Chaz slammed on the brakes because they are at the hospital, and Chaz says back to Straff, "Calm down. I've done this more times than Dr. Kildare." Then we cut to inside the hospital where we see Michelle is in a wheelchair, and she is talking to a nurse, and the nurse is saying, "Now then, lovey, you wait here, okay? We'll be taking you up to obstetrics in a bit." And an unsure Michelle says, "Yeah, but the nurse cuts her off saying, "Don't fret now. Your boyfriend will be back soon. He'll cheer you up, and I'll bet you can't wait to have it out of you, eh?" But before Michelle can answer, the double doors next to them burst open, and we see Betty come through along with Straff, and she's being pushed on a gurney, and one of the emergency personnel is saying, Benny, get the crash cart. We have an emergency here." And Michelle yells out, "Christ!" Then we see Betty stare up at her and hold out her hand towards Michelle as she's hurriedly pushed past on the gurney. Then we cut to the waiting area where we see Rich walking up to John and Chaz, and Rich is saying, "Far and outside it, man. It's the lads. Oi, conjob, what do you reckon then? They're going to stick tweezers up her fanny and pull the little bastard out." And we see Rich pull out some cigars, and as he's about to hand them to John, he says, "Here you are, look, Cuban tampons." But Chaz and John just look up at him with dour expressions, and Rich asks, What's the problem?" And John answers, "Betty's had a heart attack, Rich. They've got her inside right now." And Chaz says, "Oh, well, that's bad, right?" But John doesn't answer him. He just turns to Chaz and asks, "Now what?" And Chaz looks at him and answers, "Now we get drunk." But it doesn't look like they go with Chaz's suggestion, because as we turn the page, we see Danny hugging Straff and John watching this, and John's narration says, "Funny what happens inside of a hospital. It's a world of extremes, not one floor apart. Upstairs, everyone's flushed and eager, waiting for the arrival of a new life. Downstairs, all is pale and bland, as we usher out the last few less than precious moments of an old life. And all night, me, Danny, and Chaz are up and down like a whore's drawers." And just like the narration said, we're getting panels of John at each of the different areas waiting. One room with Straff and Danny, and the other room with Rich and Chaz. So as we see Chaz walk up with a pizza to John and Rich, John's narration says, "Upstairs, Chaz has discovered the worst pizza in Christendom. Still, no baby." Then we see John with Straff, and the narration continues saying, "Downstairs, you can tell it's almost time by the clock on the wall." Then we see John and Danny, and they're in a different waiting room than everyone else now. It must be like a private one because Danny is typing away on her computer, and John is taking a nap. And over this, the narration says, 1 a.m., almost there. 2 a.m., any moment now. Then we cut to Betty's room where Straff is sitting next to her, and he's saying, "I never meant it, Mom. Honest, I was just worried. I didn't want to be on my own." And then he says under his breath, "What are you thinking about?" And then he grabs his mom's limp hand and he rests his head on it. Then we transition from that panel of Betty in bed to that of Michelle in bed, and Rich is sitting in the same position as Straff was, except he's just completely asleep and not holding on to Michelle's hand. Then we turn the page and we cut to John smoking in the hospital, which I'm pretty sure wasn't allowed even back then. We see Danny talking to Chaz in the background, and John's narration says, "Round about 3 a.m., and we're still in denial, trying to ignore that terrible dichotomy of life and death. Everything's settled down a bit. People gravitate to where they feel the most comfortable." Then we see John look over at Chaz and Danny talking, and his narration continues. "Good old Chaz has proven to be an absolute bloody prince, really, but he can't hide his desire to be upstairs with all the newborn lambs. And me, I'm better off with the dead and dying. It's what I'm used to, isn't it?" And just as John thinks this, we see Rich run in, and he goes straight to John and says, "John, sorry, mate. I need you to do us a favor. They told me to hurry because they're influencing the labor. I can't do it, man. I'm too bloody chicken." And then Rich holds up a camera, and it seems he's asking John to film the birth of his child. Then we cut to Michelle's room, and the narration says, 4 a.m. on a hospital floor somewhere. There's a flurry of activity. Everything happens at once, all at the same time. Beat, wait, And I believe when the narration says beat, it's meaning like the sound of a heart rate monitor. And we see inside the room, Michelle is giving birth, and John is in fact filming it, which is actually a good thing because as Rich watches his wife giving birth, we see him pass out. Then we cut to the room of Betty, and she wakes up and she kind of says through her tubes, Robert. And then she begins to cough violently. Then we get some panels that are showing in tandem what's happening in both the different rooms. And over both of them, we see heartbeats erratically beating. One is of Betty's and one is of Michelle's. And then the one with Betty goes silent as Michelle is given her baby, and then there's a steady heartbeat. So it kind of looks like Betty's line goes silent, and then it starts beating again in the panel with Michelle holding her newborn baby. Then we turn the page and we cut to the funeral of Betty, and it's inside of a church, and we see a priest is doing the service, and all of the friends are looking at Rich's new baby, while Rich just sits alone by himself on his own pew. And over these panels, John's narration says, 3 days later, and Betty's memory hangs in the air like coal dust. The cremation ceremony is a disgusting, pointless moment that's supposed to be sweet but turns out like shit, just as she would have wanted it. Over to one side, everyone's trying to somehow absorb the untapped potential of little Ivy May. The alternative is to accept that we're all eventually going to go into the fire, some sooner than others. Then we hear the priest say, and so we consign her body to the flames. Then we see the curtain drop and close up around the coffin, and Straff says under his breath, bye, Mom. And as the funeral finishes, everybody begins to stand and walk out, and we see John is smoking in the background, just kind of watching everybody, and John's narration says, there's an awkward silence as the flames rise, a nervous shuffling amongst the partygoers. There's a hissing of gas, a beat. Then baby Ivy May begins to cry, and John gets kind of a shocked look on his face, and he pauses smoking, and his narration says, and in that moment, I swear I get a whiff of old lady perfume. And to me, this is pretty creepy. This is kind of insinuating that Chaz's mom, who was not the best person, somehow was able to, in the hospital, transfer souls or something like that, and now the baby is her. At least that's what I'm getting from this kind of ambiguous ending. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just saying how, like, it's a coincidence how life and death come together at the same time. But this being Hellblazer, I'd tend to err on the side of the old lady definitely possessed a baby. But that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.